I'm Karen Rohlf, and welcome to Horse Training in Harmony. This podcast is about you making progress with your horse in a way that you both can love. It's about learning how to move and be in harmony. Because yes, you really can develop a horse to be both athletic and happy. When we show up as our best selves for our horses will show up for us. So, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I have a really special guest for you guys today, and this is Antonia Henderson, and she's a professor at Langara, I think is how I say that right, college in Vancouver. She's an equine psychologist. She has a Ph.D. in personality social psychology. And I first became aware of Antonia when I was up in Canada, and I got a copy of, oh my gosh, I think it's Horse Sport magazine. It's a Canadian magazine. She had an article in there, and then since then I've researched other articles, but her article was about the happy athlete, you know? So I was like, wow, this is something that I really am interested in. And she just shed so much light on some things that are really important to me, but from the scientific perspective. But you're also a rider, right? Is it dressage that you do?
Or? I do dressage, yeah. I actually came up through the hunter jumper ranks, but then I switched to dressage about 10 years ago, decided it was probably time to keep all 4 feet on the ground, and so I've been pursuing that ever since and compete at the amateur level.
Awesome. Yeah, and something because I'm actually have a bachelor's in biology, and my dad's a professor at university in the science department. So I have a science brain, but I also have the horse lover brain. And so a lot of the things that you wrote about really connected with me, because you could see it from the I love my horse perspective, and then also from the scientific perspective. So two things that many things really connected with what I wanted to talk to you about. But two things in particular really struck me, and I'd love for you to be able to talk a little bit more about these. And one is kind of connected to when I teach and when I train, I really value curiosity as like high on my list of characteristics to really bring out in people and in horses. And so you talked about an experiment measuring sort of the investigativeness, the level of kind of curiosity, and how much a horse is willing to investigate, and connected it to their lifestyle and whether they're in an environment that's social or they have room to move and they're feeling, happy, compared to horses in more of a stressful or even a learned helplessness state. And it's such a passion of mine to look at the industry standard for horse care. When you go to a training barn, if a new horse owner says, how am I supposed to keep my horse? And they go to the best training facility, the model is not necessarily ideal for horses. Everybody's packed into stalls. And I just think it's time that we took a fresh look at this, and I love that you're actually able to measure it. So that's the one thing, is kind of, there's a lot there, I'm sure, but the investigativeness and how you can measure how their lifestyle affects that, because I think the trait of curiosity and investigativeness for training is great. But as you will point out, sometimes the horses that are not investigating are actually described as very good boys or very compliant. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a new way of looking at that. And then, I think that's a whole subject in itself. And then part of the learned helplessness piece when I'm training, one of the promises that I make to my horses is that whenever they feel a pressure, there is always something that they can do to ease the pressure. There's always an open door. That's and so the difference between those kind of aids, where you kind of present a puzzle, give them a moment to find the answer, versus always very controlling aids, which can be a split second of difference in timing, but it can make all the difference in the world to keep them alive. So having rambled about all that, I'd love for you just to share your thoughts on this, and yeah, what I'll let you go now.
Okay, well, I can certainly talk more about the investigative behavior that you were talking about. In that particular study, the test that they did with horses is what they call a cognitive bias test. And cognitive bias meaning, is their thinking biased in a particular direction towards optimism or pessimism? And it's a test that's been done with other animals, and they only recently done with horses. Of course, when we're trying to find out what horses are thinking or what any animals are thinking, we can't, we can't get them to take part in interviews and fill out questionnaires, and so we have to get pretty creative about how we're going to look at that. And so this study was quite cool. They had a horse was trained to understand that the bucket a lidded bucket on the right-hand side of this paddock enclosure would always contain a food reward, and the one on the other side never would. And so horses would, start to understand that if they went and they learned how to open the lid and flip up the lid and get their treat on the right-hand side bucket. Then what they did was start to introduce other buckets in between those two. So, and the question was whether horses would investigate or not investigate. And what they found was that the horses, they had two different sources of horses. One were from riding schools, and those horses were kept inside. I think some of them might have had small paddock turnout, but not very much, and were kept in, basically how we keep our horses in stalls, and were ridden because they were school horses. They had a fair bit of exercise under saddle, but they didn't really have any free time. Then the other horses were ones that were privately owned and kept at people's homes. They lived in paddocks with another horse. Lived in pastures, sorry, I should say, with another horse and or a herd. And so had what they call a very enriched environment as opposed to the impoverished environment of the school horses. And what they found was that the horses with the enriched environment had much more investigative behavior. They would first of all go to the right, get their treat, eat that up, and then start exploring all the other buckets to see if, possibly the jackpot is here as well, even though it wasn't. And but the other horses who had lived in this impoverished environment went to the bucket, got their treat reward, and then stopped, just gave up, and just didn't bother investigating any further. And what they were linking it to, and I think that there's a lot of support for this, is this idea of learned helplessness. That would you like me to describe a bit about learned helplessness?
I would love that. Yes,
okay.
Please.
Okay. Well, Martin Seligman was the first one to study learned helplessness and coined the term. That was in 1968. And he actually did these pretty horrific experiments with dogs where they were put on a floor, and they heard the sound of a bell. And then when they heard the sound of the bell, the floor became electrically charged. And they learned that if they jumped over the barrier onto the other side of the floor, they got away from the shock. And so dogs were trained to pay attention to the sound of that bell, and that meant get the hell out of Dodge and get over to the other side. Then what he did, which is the horrible part of the experiment, is that he charged the floor on both sides, so that no amount of jumping back and forth was going to relieve that electric shock. And what ended up happening was the dogs just lay down on the floor that was electrically charged and cried. And when then he reintroduced the escape route, where they could jump onto the other side and relieve the suffering, they didn't try. They just gave up.
Wow.
And he coined that term learned helplessness, that when dogs or other animals or people are faced with inescapable aversive events, they give up trying. And people have looked at this in situations of domestic abuse, children in abusive situations, and and latterly looking at animals in captivity and particularly horses, and although horses' suffering is so subtle that we tend not to see it. And what researchers are now looking at is that this state of learned helplessness is actually something that we might even try and foster. We might even like, because they're good horses. They behave themselves. They don't give us any trouble. And so isn't that what we want? A nice, compliant, good-natured guy, and we don't see their suffering. And then when we relate that to housing, that's huge, because I keep on saying to people, if there is one thing I could change by all the work I do and the writing I do about and being an equine psychologist, the one thing I would change is how we house our performance horses today. And solitary confinement is just as hard for horses as it is for people, and we use it to torture people. In fact, recently we've decided it's too heinous a torture to keep on doing. And we're looking at our whole prison system and the whole question of solitary confinement because it's too horrible. Yeah. And that's how we keep our horses.
Yeah. And it's really, they're such amazing creatures because they can forgive so much, but they can just deal with it. And it's sort of amazing as a flight animal. But something that I've heard stories of happening again and again is you have a beginner or a timid rider. They want to have the sweetest, most gentle, bomb-proof horse. So they go to the riding stable and they pick the one that's like the reliable beginner lesson horse, and they bring it home. And at some point, some months later, the horse relaxes and goes, life is pretty good. And out comes this monster. And it's happened enough times that I'm thinking, I don't think that I think that was a shut down, a checked out horse. And then his nervous system came alive and he hadn't, really had the communication. And what you're saying just resonates so much with me on so many levels. And I think there's so many little choices where we can either, try to get a horse just to deal with something or be obliging, or, for me, the goal is communication and cooperation. So little things like a horse that had someone ask me to help them with a horse who was terrified of being in the wash stall. And it was a Spanish barn, and they'd go in, put the horse there, and then clip them on. And most horses just stood there, and this horse was just losing it. So when I took it, I let him in the wash stall, and then he went to run out, and I let him run out. And then back in and out, and back in and out. And they're like, oh, you need to. And I was like, no, let's wait until he decides he's okay. And that was just their routine. They were on a schedule. That horse didn't fit. And just after just letting the horse do that he wasn't helpless. He could, have a choice. Yeah. Then he became okay with the wash stall, and then you could clip him. But but how many times are there little choices where we, the phrase knock the curiosity out of the horse, or make him feel like he doesn't have a choice, and so many of those little things adding up, then so it's funny because a lot of times when horses come to me, it was kind of a joke. I was like, oh, come to me for naughtiness training. I'll turn your horse into the most annoying horse in the barn. And I have a lot of kind of extroverted, gotta be into everything, and I love that. Even though sometimes they're a little harder to deal with in the moment, but ultimately the training for me is so much better because I've got a horse that's like proud of himself, and they know what the game is, and they're into it. But I do understand that in some situations, you want a just compliant horse to be just go follow the rail and don't look right or left. So I think it's a really interesting question you bring up is, are we doing this on purpose?
I mean, and certainly in certain industry breed standards, that is what they're looking for. In the today's show ring hunter that's supposed to be, practically unconscious. The Western pleasure horse with his nose on the ground. I mean, I don't want to pick on particular disciplines. I think we see it in a lot of places where it started out with an idea that I think with hunters it was, their manners and way of going would be judged, and then somehow somebody decided that manners and way of going meant to be just unbelievably slow and unconscious. I think the introduction of the hunter derbies has actually been a positive thing, because it's asking for a horse that jumps big jumps and jumps with some pace and actually, is allowed to shake his head in the corner because he did it, he had it jumped with some effort and feeling pretty good about that.
Yeah.
But the more that we're going towards that kind of, we're just, we breed this animal with all this athleticism, and then try and take all the athleticism out of it.
Yeah, leave it to humans to take a positive thing and keep going with it until it's a negative. And I think competition is challenging because it changes people's priorities. And like you said, now there's more and more horses. You spend 6 figures on a horse, or whatever is expensive to you, and the tendency is to go, oh, I don't want him to get hurt. Oh, I don't want him to get kicked by another horse, and that just feeds into the putting them in boxes. And another thing that you wrote about was an experiment where you measured the negative behaviors that were showing up and measured the cortisol levels, and cortisol levels are higher in the stressed horses, that. But the couple things that I thought were interesting is, one, the horses that were weaving and pawing and maybe things like that actually had lower levels because they were finding an outlet for the stress. And then when you said that when you asked the caretakers to kind of keep a log or the experiment was done where caretakers kept a log on the negative behaviors, and in the higher stressed barns, the caretakers were having trouble even noticing when the behavior was showing up because it was just too normal for them. So I think that's another real interesting wake-up call for the industry, going, not only is it present, but even when asked to see it and keep a log of it, you're just not seeing it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you touch on two things there, and one I think is, and certainly another one of my things in the industry I'd like to change is that horses with stereotypies, and what we mean by a stereotypy is a repetitive chronic behavior that it has a particular sequence, but it doesn't seem to serve any obvious purpose. And so we think of cribbing and weaving, but you can also have milder stereotypies, such as the horse playing with his tongue, or nodding his head, or doing weird things with his lips. And it doesn't mean that they just do it once. It's like a polar bear pacing at the zoo. It has a very, very set sequence and this chronic pattern. And what they've found with some of these stereotypies is that it actually clicks into the brain's reward system, and so becomes a stress reducer. It actually gives a beta-endorphin high is probably the wrong word, but certainly a calming agent. And so it really, and there's been research back and forth about what's called the coping hypothesis, but I think there's starting to be some pretty hard evidence showing actual physiological changes in cortisol levels, heart rate, etc., for horses that are cribbing, and that it actually does help them to manage a stressful environment. And people often say, well, my horse doesn't live in a stressful environment. I look after him beautifully. But I would argue that most modern sport horses living in boarding stables, in stalls, are living in a stressful environment. And I know those are kind of hard words, but horses weren't designed for stalls. Stalls were designed for people. And, so these horses are doing their best to cope. And then when we try and prevent them from doing that through cribbing collars that give them electric shocks, that stick spikes into their gullet, I was even reading about a preventative measure called cribbing rings, where they put actual rings in between the gums of the teeth, so when the horse grabs onto a hard surface, it exerts pressure and pain. And then one vet was saying, no, it's really better if you actually drill through the bone, because then they don't come out, and use bigger rings. I mean, it's just heinous. But to me, the worst cruelty is just preventing them at all. Like, if you have, it doesn't, people talk about a humane cribbing collar because it doesn't stick butt spikes in them and it doesn't electric shock them, but it stops them from cribbing. And that's not humane. They need to crib, So my say is provide a safe injection site. Give them a place to crib where they're not going to pull their water bowl off the wall and they're not going to destroy the barn, and let them do it. And then as much as you can, start to improve their environment by giving them more turnout time, let them socialize with other horses, let them touch other horses, and I know that people are really nervous about that because they say, God, this horse is so expensive. I can't afford to have him injured. But shall I speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, because I understand it, but I also know that there's other injuries and illnesses that happen because they're not moving. Exactly. The tendon ligament chances of, if they're standing a stall and they go out and do something athletic, or the chance of colic because they're not moving and grazing normally, and ulcers and so I'd love to hear.
Because I think that, I think to a certain extent the fear that horses will injure each other if they're turned out together is unfounded. One of my favorite studies is one that was done at the Swiss National Stud with their stallions. This was Sabrina Brafer-Freeman who did this, and she looked at turning the stallions out together in their non-breeding season, and everybody's like, "What? You can't do that!" I mean, these aren't horses out on the range. I mean, these are expensive sport horses, and they're the real thing here. That's a lot of horse, and she said, no, I think this is doable, and they took some precautions. They allowed the horses to meet each other over the fence first and in adjacent stalls, so there was some pre-exposure. They removed their hind shoes before the first encounter. They were able to put them back on again after about 4 days. They made sure that the stallions were far away from the mares. They made sure that resources were plentiful. Horses don't fight if there's nothing to fight about, so there are lots of hay stations. And what they found was that the horses engaged in what they call ritualistic behaviors, which are kind of an abbreviation of the real behavior. Like, I'm going to strike you, and the foot comes up this high. I'm going to bite you, and a lot of squealing and a lot of carrying on, but actually no contact. And they found that after 3 or 4 days, all of that subsided, and there was nothing. And in subsequent years, because then they would put them back into this intensive management when they were in their breeding season, and then in non-breeding season they'd do it again, and they found that in subsequent years even that ritualistic behavior subsided.
Wow.
And it really makes sense, because we do see bachelor bands in horses in feral conditions where stallions hang out together, and when we think about it, horses have evolved to avoid confrontation. It's evolutionarily costly. It's much better if you can get someone to go away without engaging in a fight, because that's going to be resource costly to you. It's going to be winners or losers. It's going to be resource costly. It doesn't make sense. So if you can find a way around it without fighting, that's going to be better. I mean, the only caveat I would say with that is when we're turning our horses out together, we have to remember that they're not choosing their friends, we're choosing them. So we might be wrong. Like, they don't all love each other. I mean, there might be a personality conflict. So that's where you try it out with the pre-exposure, between stalls, and let horses touch and find out who's compatible and who's not. And, if they're not compatible, don't turn those ones out together.
Yeah.
Choose a different pair.
Yeah, and that's so great. And in my herd, I have a herd of boys, and then I have 2 mares, and then I have this other horse that came to me late. And when he came from a competition barn, and when he came, they said he can't be turned out for more than 45 minutes, and they were correct. he went out, and about 45 minutes later, he starts running in a panic, going, oh my God, I have to get back in my stall. So it took some time where I had to have a stall with a paddock, and then he could go in and out and test it out. And
Yeah.
he would only go out there for 45 minutes, he'd go back in a stall, but that's not normal. That's a
No.
mentally ill horse. So then
Yeah.
it got to be, oh, look, he's out in the paddock more. Then I moved him to a pasture that was away from his stall, and then he could only be out there for 2 hours. But I just gradually expanded it. Now he's out all the time. But there's one, I have a very little horse who's actually really dominant. So around feeding time, if they were together, it's just chaos. And especially if there were mares around, because the little one's very stallion-y. But so what I do is so they're in 3 different places, but at night, Hot Shot gets to go out, the big one who came from the competition barn. He gets to go out at night and explore the whole property. And then during the day, when I ride my horses, one by one, I ride them and then let them loose. And I ride the little one last. So he gets a chance all morning to socialize with everybody. Everybody is all together, the mares and the geldings. And then when I turn the little one out, the mares go back in their little paddock because they're on a diet anyway. And all the boys go out together, and I put the big one, Hot Shot, back. So there can be a little creativity, but all my horses get a chance to be with each other and be outside their pasture, but inside a safe area that's really interesting. And I even find, they got like 10-acre pastures that every few months I switch which pasture they're in, and they get so happy. They're like, the new, they have to change. It's like something different. It just breaks my heart when you see a horse standing in a stall or in the same paddock like year after year. And, some people have limited areas, but I always think there's a way you can make things more interesting for them and find a way, like you said, find the combination that works and do it smartly, but to return them to normal. It's not normal when someone says, oh, my horse needs a stall. He's not okay outside. I'm like, that's mental illness.
That's it. He needs to be deinstitutionalized.
And one of my newest quests is, to look at the business model, because the business model is what also feeds into horses being in stalls, because every trainer needs to pack as many training horses in as possible, or lesson horses. And there's just, space, it just comes down to numbers. But I think it's time that the professional way of keeping a horse is actually the best for the horse, except for maybe short periods of time. So.
Yeah, I actually saw at a conference, the International Society of Equine Science conference was presenting, and somebody showed us this video footage of horses being kept in a kind of a loafing shed similar to how cows are kept, and with about that density. I mean, there were Shetland ponies and show jumpers and dressage horses, and they were all milling about inside in a big shed. And then they had this big conveyor belt that came around with hay, and the dominant horses got at the front of the line and the more subordinate ones got at the end of the line. And I thought, wow, that is revolutionary. And of course it reduced their staffing costs tremendously, right? It was just so much easier. They even had a kind of a sort of like a vacuum thing that picked up droppings that went around,
like a Roomba?
And went around in and around the horses. God. And because they were trying to show that I think what they were trying to illustrate was that it is possible to keep horses in group housing in a very economical way. And I think that people have, one of the drawbacks of it is that people have said, well, we don't have that kind of acreage, we can't possibly do that. And I think, as you say, we need to be more creative about this, because what we're doing is extraordinarily harmful. And it isn't okay that we so have to change that. And if we don't have a lot of space, then we have to figure out how to do it without a lot of space. And sure, when you go and see the green hills of Kentucky and see these mares and foals out on acres and acres and acres of pasture, well, of course that's ideal. But horses are pretty compromising. If we just gave them a little, they'd be so much happier.
There's
if you just let them match, they're happier.
Yeah. Have you heard of like the idea of like a paddock paradise, or some people, they have their farm, and you know how a lot of times farms will have like a perimeter fence that goes around, and some small farms can make like a little perimeter path that goes kind of around the whole property and weaves in and out. It doesn't really take, you know, any more space. If you only have like a barn, an arena, and then another one turnout, you can have a little lane, and then you put like the water is way over here, and then the hay is way over there, and the horses have to actually travel during the day and go find where they're.
That's a fantastic idea.
Yeah,
No, I hadn't seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, and I think again it keeps their lives a little bit more interesting. And for those of us who are interested in training, you know, I want my horse's brain like, what's happening?
Yeah. I mean, even things like food choices. Like they find that stereotypies can be reduced when you give horses multiple choices of forage, like so different kinds of hay, and put them in different feeding stations. So put one in a hay net, put one in a manger, put one something in different places in their enclosure, and they actually find that they take longer to eat their food, so that they're eating longer, which is again another one of our problems with our modern housing practices, is we give them this absolutely fabulous, delicious hay and grain that's consumed in a minute, and then the horse is standing there with long periods of an empty stomach and nothing to do, which makes them vulnerable to ulcers and to stereotypies or other kinds of abnormal behaviors, like your horse that couldn't get turned out. You know, we wouldn't call that a stereotypy, but it's certainly abnormal. And but just even giving them choice.
I love that idea. Just a simple choice, and I wonder how many other choices that, you know, these, again, the little moments in your day with your horse, when the horse hesitates, or, you know, I have one horse that when I trailer her somewhere, sometimes on the way home, she's like, I don't want to get in the trailer. And then I get this message. I'm like, she'll look at the other side. I'm like, do you want to ride on the other side of the trailer? And I open that side and she'll get right on. You know, like, I mean, it's ridiculous, but, you know, I'm open to that. Like, you know, I can be flexible, but, you know, you think about how many times that maybe those choices are not allowed to happen. And when you say like just with feed choice, how that can lower the stress of a horse, how many other little times, you know, could we just maybe be a little flexible and see what the horse is wanting to do, and not always go for just stand there and be compliant, do your job.
I mean, I recently my horse had to have a layoff for a little while, and I moved him to a friend's place where he was out of a show barn and is in a situation where he can go in and out 24/7, and he is never inside. Even to eat his hay, my friend had to put the hay closer to the door because he likes to stand outside and put his head in to eat. Funny. And it's, you know, it's raining, it's snowstorms, it's like, no, he's like, I've had the life of a show horse. I'm not getting trapped in there again. He always, you know, that's his choice, is to be outside all the time. I mean, he has a great blanket and he's got a hood and he's like dry and warm, but I think given the choice, horses would not choose what we've created for them. That's for sure.
I took one of my horses to a training barn once to just, you know, play with this trainer and show her what I was doing. And I was like, I just need a little paddock. He'll be fine. And it started to drizzle, and she came outside. She's like, you've got to put him in. I'm like, no, I don't. You know, he's fine. She's like, no, it's raining. I was like, he's fine. And I mean, I ended up putting him in the stall because I thought she was going to have stress. I'm like, this lady's freaking out. I was like, I'm sorry, Monty, you're going to stay in the stall and I'll take you out for a walk. But I mean, it's like so ingrained. Like, no, I'm like, it's a horse. That was super interesting. And it's so nice to get some scientific confirmation of what feels right to me. I'm always, whenever I have a horse standing in a stall, it's like I feel it every minute of the day. I'm like, oh my God, he's still in a stall. So that's really great to get that insight. Thank you. Now I'd like to ask a little bit more about the timing of aids and how that affects their mental state and psychology, and the difference between just controlling aids, the kind of I got to get it done now. What sometimes I call it we have to cross the highway. It's like we're going aids. And then there's the communication aids, which are always my goal, which is I present a pressure, a suggestion, something going, what do you think about this? The horse can experiment a little bit, find the answer, and then I say yes. And, a little bit of, I think, negative reinforcement and then a little bit of positive reinforcement that a lot of riding is that I'll present some sort of pressure, which doesn't always mean, I'm clobbering him, but like, here's a suggestion. I'm asking for something. What can you do? When they do it, the pressure goes away, and then I might say thank you and give a reward. Compared to the, chain over the nose, strong aids, and here we go, we got to get across the highway. We'll talk about this later. Because I find, us going back to competition, the prevalence of competition is kind of the skill of getting it done right now, whether it's working or not. And that is a skill. But then I think a lot of times people teach those skills of just get it done, get it done, get it done, keep your leg on, keep your leg on, keep your leg on, instead of instructing. And people don't necessarily know that they're learning controlling aids compared to building a communication. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that sort of subject.
Yeah, I mean, Karen, you're touching on a lot of real issues in basic learning theory, and I think what we see often in the scientific description of how horses learn, how rats, pigeons, people learn, there are a lot of similarities there, and we learn the primary way that we teach horses to go under saddle is through negative reinforcement. And a lot of people say, oh, no, I don't use negative reinforcement, and they're confusing it with punishment. And actually, negative reinforcement and punishment are entirely different things. Negative reinforcement is when we apply some kind of stimulus, usually something that's slightly aversive, and then when we release that pressure, that's the indicator that that's the behavior we want. And so we make it more likely that we'll see that behavior in the future. So we're trying to encourage a wanted behavior through the release of pressure or the release of a slightly aversive stimulus. Punishment is exactly the opposite. Punishment is trying to get rid of a behavior we don't want by applying an aversive stimulus after the behavior has occurred. And usually isn't all that effective in horse training. There are a lot of conditions that need to be exactly right for punishment to actually work. And one of the biggest problems with it is that rather than associating it with the behavior we don't want, they associate it with the person who delivered it. and so we make an enemy out of ourselves to our horses. So, but negative reinforcement, the key to successful negative reinforcement is the release. That is the indicator to the horse that yes, that's the behavior I want. Yes, you've done the right thing. So if I apply pressure with my legs and the horse moves forward, I need to release that pressure to tell him moving forward was the behavior I'm looking for. Or if I apply pressure with one leg, the horse doesn't know that means go sideways, but he tries out different things because, well, that leg there doesn't feel that great. Maybe I'll try stepping over here. Nope, that didn't work. Oh, she wants me to step over here. Then if we release that pressure, that's telling the horse, yeah, you got it. That's the behavior I want. When we don't release the pressure, we punish him. We've actually done exactly the opposite of what we want. Rather than making that behavior more likely to occur in the future, we're making it less likely. Because now we've said, we apply pressure, the horse moves, we keep on applying pressure, so he's saying, oh, well, I guess that's not it. And we make it less likely that we're going to see that behavior in the future. So we're working in the opposite way that we intend.
Wow.
And often as amateurs, we do that inadvertently. We end up, the horse makes a tremendous effort over a jump and we lose our balance and we catch him in the mouth telling him, don't do that again. Or our horse is, in beautiful self-carriage and we are so excited about that we forget to ease up on the reins. And so the horse goes, oh, I guess self-carriage isn't it. So a lot of the trick good negative reinforcement is good timing. And sometimes as amateurs, we don't always have that, or as beginner riders, we don't necessarily have that. But we can develop it and we can get better at it, and horses are tremendously forgiving. So they seem to be able to put up with quite a few mistakes and keep on trying to find the right answer. And I think that's where, but we can, as I say, inadvertently punish our horses when we think that if we don't release that pressure. And that's where we really need to think about negative reinforcement, is the reward is the release of the pressure, the release of whatever it is you're doing, if it's pulling on the reins or if it's squeezing with the legs or if it's whatever those things are. And that tells the horse, yes, you have given me the right behavior.
Yeah.
What we would ideally...
No, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, no, I was just going to say what we would ideally like to do is to be able to work towards not having to use negative reinforcement at all. And we can use that with another kind of learning that we talk about with classical conditioning. And I won't get too bogged down in the learning terminology, but if we put two things together, and those things are always paired, if I say the word asparagus and the horse always gets a carrot, then he's going to find out that the word asparagus is a pretty good thing, right?
Yeah,
and that's really what clicker training is all about. It's really just putting in a marker for teaching the horse something good will happen. Mm-hmm. So if we're using negative reinforcement, and let's say I want my horse to collect his gait, and I start to apply some pressure with the reins, and I start to try and engage him with my legs, I'm putting on some negative reinforcement. He gives me some more self-carriage. I release that pressure. But if at the same time I can do that, I get the self-carriage, and then I do a tightening of my core muscle, I'm teaching my horse that tightening of my core muscle, in fact, if I do that slightly before I do the negative reinforcement, which would be the proper timing, then I'm teaching him that tightening of my core muscles means that I want you to collect. And you can avoid me pulling on your reins or kicking your sides if you do that first. And so we can actually move towards using this tool of classical conditioning, giving them a cue that isn't aversive in any way, that's saying that's the behavior I want. And ultimately that's what that would be beautiful training. It's an ideal that we would all strive towards, so that we can have a horse in self-carriage without using any negative reinforcement.
Yeah. That's really awesome, and that's something that I really highlight, is to, before asking, that we have an intention and we have a body language associated with. So I like to have my horse, because they what a job they have. They have to figure out, okay, is she waving to her friend, or am I supposed to do something here? So I think it's really important that that the person has this intention, because they have to know, is she adjusting her stirrups, or is that a leg yield? What the heck's going on? And, I do believe they can read our intentions, or if nothing else, we're more focused when we have an intention, and they can feel something changing. But I like to teach a body language. So especially with riding, if you tighten your core, it's going to change how your seat moves. It'll naturally affect their back. But even on the ground, I start it with, I'm going to sit up. So say my horse is trotting along and I'd like them to go more collected, I'll start to sit up. Now, when I first do that, they're like, what's she doing? But I might sit up, and then I might ask them for a transition to halt, or, and then trot again, or something where they're like, oh, she brought her weight kind of back. I better be ready for that. So it's like the cue that your dream aid first. Then if they can't find the answer, I might go, can I give you a hint? I'll add on some sort of pressure or something that makes them go, how do I get that to stop? Release it, go, and so that hopefully if I'm consistent, they go, you know what? Every time before she starts waving that stick, in front of me 10 feet, she does this with her body. I can see that. Because I really think this is, from the zebras on the plains that have to be able to discern the difference between a lion who gets up because he's just stretching and going to lay back down, or a lion who's thinking, I'm hungry, and then
important distinction.
They have, I think it's really within their range. It's not woo-woo. It's like they can read intention. They can feel when someone's thinking in their direction. And I think we need to use that. And what you mentioned about, the very sincere mistakes that we make. We all do it. We're in the wrong place. We fumble. We lose our balance. And thank God that horses are forgiving. But I do know it's also taught. It's taught on purpose, because I get a lot of these students and horses coming to me. I mean, it's very normal in a competition dressage arena to go listen to the warm-up ring, and you'll hear, keep your leg on, don't let him get lazy. Then they'll give him a break, but keep him going, and riders are, hold it, don't let that shoulder, hold that shoulder. And I'm thinking, gosh, it's just constantly controlled. And I never thought about what you said of negative reinforcement without the release turns into punishment. So as soon as you're saying, keep your leg on so he doesn't slow down, so he's going, but keep your leg on, you're actually punishing your horse a little bit every single stride. And
that's the behavior we want.
And that's the behavior we want.
We're punishing him when he's giving us the desired behavior. And I think that, but sorry, I'm sort of jumping in here, but I wanted to talk about what we have to understand what we mean by the desired behavior, because if, I'm not going to have my 4-year-old piaffing. I mean, so how do I get to piaffe? And that's where we have to understand, again, learning theory talks about shaping, which is rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. So I am obviously not going to get all of that from day one, and I have to be really in tune for any offering that's in the right direction and to reward that with the release of that pressure. And I mean, that's how we see these incredible feats that dogs do in movies, or that, any of those kind of behaviors are taught through shaping, that we, there's some behaviors that occur spontaneously. If I want my horse to pee on command, every time I see him pee, I give it a cue and give him a treat. I can get my horse to pee on command. It's very handy when you have to do a drug test or something. Yeah, right. But, to have my horse, do some behaviors like, jump over 6-foot fences in front of Jumbotron at Madison Square Gardens, no, not so likely. But so we have to reward those little baby steps along the way, and I think sometimes what we forget is what is a baby step. Even in things like trailer loading, a horse putting his head down and sniffing the ramp is a reward, should be a rewarded behavior. He's investigating, he's having a look, and so often, or a horse takes one step on a trailer and then people start beating him to keep him going. No, reward that behavior. That's exactly what we want. Take the pressure off at that point, right? That's where we want to be rewarding those baby steps, and I think that's a really integral part of it.
Oh, definitely. And can just simply that kind of riding, of not paying attention to that and just using controlling, can that cause learned helplessness?
Absolutely. I think that those are, we can have sort of two situations. We end up, when there's no release of pressure, when it's inescapable and there's no right answer, we often get conflict behaviors, what often people call naughty behaviors. And the horse isn't being naughty, he's trying to find a way out. It's like, this is a really, really uncomfortable place to be and I can't be here anymore, so I'm going to buck or rear or bolt or do whatever I can to get out of this pressure. Or they give up, and then we have that learned helplessness where we get that, and you can, that kind of glazed over look on a horse's eyes. I mean, sometimes you do see that in school horses. I think that, I don't think that necessarily has to come with a school horse if they're given enough free time, enough turnout time, and because of course they are going to be dealing with beginners, and beginners are probably going to not be good with that release of pressure. But I think when they don't get any other outlet in their life to be horses, then we often do see that learned helplessness. And as you say, that situation where we have a horse that's just, bomb-proof. Well, yeah, but horses weren't exactly designed to be bomb-proof. In fact, they were designed to be exactly the opposite. So, because the ones who if something was suspicious or scary, the ones who got the hell out of Dodge were the ones who survived and passed on those genes to future generations. And the ones who went, oh, looks okay to me, probably wouldn't be here today.
Yeah, it brings up, if you want your horse to be okay in lots of situations, kind of if you do it in one way, you're gradually building their trust and their exposure. And if you do it in another way, you're risking something that may look bomb-proof, but actually is like an explosion waiting to happen. And I've seen so many of these horses, it's like they're quiet until they're not. And, where along the way, if you allow the horse to kind of be expressive, when they're okay, when they're not, kind of early on. But, that takes the artful horsemanship, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I don't think that that's necessarily, hasn't been the focus. I mean, it's interesting that, learning theory has been really embraced by the dog world in dog training. They talk about positive reinforcement and classical conditioning and habituation and desensitization and all kinds of that. We have 100 years of psychological research behind learning theory and know how it works, and it really hasn't been embraced by the horse world. And we're more likely to be based on a bit of folklore. We talk about a horse's willingness to please. That's another one of my pet peeves, really, because I think that, because it imbues in the horse some kind of moral conscience, and that if he, this idea that he understands what we want, that he's a good soul if he goes ahead and does it, and he's a naughty and bad soul if he doesn't, that he has some kind of benevolent or malevolent intentions. And I just, no, when horses don't comply with what we want, it's because they're physically or psychologically not able to do it, or they don't understand the question. We haven't made ourselves clear, but they don't do it out of spite or revenge. I don't really believe that horses have that capacity of that kind of cognitive functioning. I mean, they're too in the moment, for one thing, to hold a grudge. I mean, they remember scary things, that's for sure, and they may make an association with a scary person, because that's also in their survival instincts. But I think that they, really, it gets pretty simple. They do what works and they stop doing what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And if they're doing something you don't want them to do, it's probably because you're making it work somehow. So figure out how to make it not work.
Right. We've created some sort of pattern that they've just learned. I like to say, all horses are perfect until we come along and ask them to do something that they don't know how to do yet or don't understand. And I try to be really conscious of that responsibility. It's like, it's all me.
Yeah.
And that's also why when I have a really good ride, I'll say, good man, you're awesome. But I also go, good job, Karen, you didn't screw that one up. There was a million ways I could have screwed that one up. But so what, and it's funny because you said years ago when I was training in a dressage facility, I had a couple students who were dog trainers, and they trained dogs for the handicapped, and they would watch me ride. And they're like, are you doing operant? Are you doing classical? I'm like, I don't know, I'm riding. And I thought, I'm a Grand Prix rider. I have no idea what this lady's talking about. But I think there is something different with riding, because at some point when you are together with your horse in balance, it really is like, you shift your weight, they move that way. It's all very, it's like a dance that just sort of naturally happens. However, the way I do dressage now, I have, a long list of things that I need to have in place in a way where I feel the horse is relaxed and understands. They get the alphabet, they got the deal, they're there. And then now I can operate in I'm going to change my balance and we're going to go together. And I do believe that can feel that must feel cool to a horse. Like, check me, I feel pride in my horses, but I think without the feeling like they're mentally stable and they love their life and they're having a good time socializing, doing their horse stuff, and they feel safe with me, and all those, there's always a way out, there's always something they can figure out. Without all that in place, the dressage doesn't feel fun to me. It just feels like,
Yeah.
cool, I really got him to move around today, you know?
Yeah, because
So,
you have to have the common language. And, uh, there's an exercise I've done with students when I'm teaching learning theory, and I get a volunteer to go out of the room, and then everybody in the classroom decides what we're going to have that person do. And so maybe it's just, walk up to the front of the room and, I don't know, stand on a chair. And the person who's left the room has no idea what we're doing. They don't know that, so they don't know that they're part of a test. We've just asked them to leave the room. That's it. And so then they come back in, and the person takes a few steps towards the front of the room, and everybody cheers and claps. And then he kind of starts to go to sit down, and everybody's just does nothing. And then he moves forward again, cheering and clapping. And so they keep on rewarding him closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior, and not rewarding what we don't want. And the person is completely at a loss. Like, they have no idea. What is this? What am I supposed to do? And then we talk about, and eventually the person will actually, then they start to get, okay, I'm going to look at my audience. Is this right? Is this right? Am I getting closer? And eventually they'll stand on the chair. And you need a really good sport to be the volunteer, right?
and someone who's like trying stuff, right?
Yeah, you choose an extrovert, somebody who's willing, investigative behavior. But then we talk about it afterwards, and the person who's put there, they said it's just, it's a horrible feeling, because it's so confusing, because you have no idea, that you don't even know that you're being asked to do something, and you have no idea what that behavior is. And I think we have to think about that every time we're asking a horse for a new movement. I mean, at least if they've been under saddle a few times, they understand that they're probably, okay, I'm going to have to stand on a chair or something. Yeah. I get that now. They're kind of a bit clued into that part, but they don't have any idea. And so we want to be so clear about when we're giving that reward, and our reward isn't even clapping in this case. It's usually just stopping doing something, that they don't like.
Right.
And so we want to be just so crystal clear and give them every advantage that we can, and so encouraging about every step that's closer to that. And I think that it's a really good exercise to kind of think what it's like to be so in the dark about it. Because when we're coming from our point of view, it makes perfect sense. What's the matter with this horse? Is so stupid. Why doesn't he get it?
Yeah. And I teach my students about what I call yes moments. Because sometimes I'll be like, oh my God, that looks great. How's that feel? And they're like, it's very nice. I'm like, does your horse know that you're loving it? So one of the things that I really teach is have a picture, like say for energy, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much energy do you want? Ask your horse, did he do it? Well, kind of. Is that a yes, or was it 100%? Was it, and I try to get people really dialed in, because a lot of times people are like, well, that's pretty good. And then I teach them like that. I'm like, oh, well, you're doing that pretty good for you, And I said, how would you feel? So I'm like, I'm gonna keep trying, keep looking, and then yes is so unmistakable. And I think sometimes when students are taught, they're like, am I doing it right? Like, it doesn't matter. What matters is you asked your horse did something. You have to give your horse feedback. It doesn't matter what anybody else looking at it thinks. It's between you and your horse. And I try to highlight what I call yes moments, and I have them say it out loud. Yes. So by the beginning of the clinic, people are like, this is pretty good. And at the end of the clinic, they're riding around going, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Yes. Where is it? Yes. But the horses so love that, like, yes, I got it, instead of a rider going, I think this is right. Well, I better just keep my leg on so it looks good. I don't know. And everybody's like, what the heck just happened this last hour? So it's really fun to get confirmation on that, and to,
and I think then once our horses understand what we're trying to say too, they're incredibly sensitive to very, very, very subtle body language, so that we don't have to be doing a whole lot of stuff, right? I mean, you know, sometimes we think that it's more leg, more this, more that, and it's not. I mean, you know, there's a great story about Clever Hans. Have you heard? Should I go for that?
Sure,
okay.
yeah. I don't know it.
Clever Hans was a horse in Berlin in the early 1900s, and owned by a guy, Mr. von Osten, and he. It turns out that this horse could, you could ask him questions and he'd paw out the correct answer. And so they asked him math problems and he could do math, and they said, you know what, and he would nod or shake his head or paw out the right answer, and he even had like an alphabet so that he, you know, he'd ponderously paw out the, I'm sure he must have had all kinds of arthritis problems from so much pawing, but he ended up being able to spell out things, and he could even, so he knew things about the calendar, he could do mathematics, he even had an opinion about a musical, whether a note was harmonious or sharp, and so this attracted quite a bit of attention, and there were more and more crowds coming to see this amazing horse, and so this was sort of also at the time when, you know, we were really invested in the fact that we had kind of white human beings at the very top of this hierarchy, and horses and animals were not capable of thought, and that they were there for our use to exploit. And so this was challenging a lot of notions about that. And so this Berlin commission came to look at this horse, and they had veterinarians and a circus trainer and a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and all doing these tests. And so they said, okay, well, obviously the owner is cueing the horse, so we need to take the owner out of the picture. And then these various people asked Hans these questions, and he got the right answer, and he kept on getting the right answer, and they're going, whoa, something weird is happening here. So they left one psychologist behind, this Oscar Funkst, and he starts going through it, and he applies the scientific method to its nth degree, you know, and goes through very, very systematically trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And so he has situations, and Hans gives him the right answers too. And so then he decides that he's going to go through and test if the examiner knows the answer, or if the examiner doesn't know the answer. So when the examiner knew the answer, Hans got the right answer. When the examiner did not know the right answer, Hans was not very good. Like, he started really failing. So he says, okay, so something's happening here. Something's coming from the examiner. And so then he does a million more tests, and finally figures out that Hans is responding to this very, very, very infinitesimal body cue, that when the horse starts counting, the person just leans over just a tad, and then as he's coming to the correct answer, the examiner lifts his eyes and leans back a tiny bit, and Hans knows if he stops pawing, then he gets carrots. And he figures that out all by himself. The Oscar Funkst then says, well, I've discovered what has happened here, and so obviously this horse is not capable of thought. Well, I would disagree. He kind of, you know, he's so invested on proving that, you know, and he even says, and Hans did not have a trace of musical ability. No kidding. No kidding, Sherlock.
Wow, that's an amazing story.
Yeah, and you know, it just, what's really cool too is that it's actually given us in psychology what we call the Clever Hans phenomena, and that is the idea that we can inadvertently cue our subjects without intending to do so. And that's why we come up with the double-blind experiment and things like that, so that we don't know you don't know the conclusion you're looking for, or you don't know what side someone's on, whether they're in the experimental or control group. But I think what Funkst missed, and what, you know, so many people miss, is how horses do communicate, and how this cue was so subtle that nobody knew they were giving it. And even when Funkst tried to suppress the cue, he wasn't very good at suppressing it. Like, he still would do it even in a really, really subtle way that Hans was picking it up. So it tells us a lot about how we ride our horses too, when we're yanking and pulling and kicking and carrying on. You know, that is completely unnecessary. Like, it can be pretty subtle, and they'll get it.
and the, you know, just that, like, the thought of that's coming up on the right answer. I mean, that's intent. Would you say that would be the horse reading your mind, reading your intention, the thought of That's it. I mean, how
Yeah,
subtle is that? So,
I know.
we talk
I mean,
about
we're like,
phases of AIDS, it starts with the
yeah,
thought, what's your
hmm
intention? Wow. I love that story. Clever Hans.
yeah,
All my
because
horses now are going to be clever Ovation and clever Natia and clever.
exactly. Because I think, and that relates into what you're saying about intention, because if our intention is to go right, our eyes will go right, our body will slightly go right in ways that we're not even aware of. So our intention sets that cue, and horses feel that because that's how they communicate with one another. They don't, the whinnying you hear on westerns and stuff is not how horses usually, they usually whinny when they can't see each other, right? But
Yeah,
most
yeah,
of
yeah.
their language is with body language and usually pretty subtle.
Yeah. That's how the herd doesn't just go,
Yeah,
They got to be.
exactly. I mean, yeah. It's like one guy is at the hay pile and he, one ear goes like this and the other
Oh,
guy's like,
yeah.
"Whoa, I don't even like hay,"
Yep, yep.
Like, I'm out of here.
Yeah, I think most of the time we're blowing them out of the water. I feel like I get one little piece right, and then I hope my horse ignores all the stuff I do wrong. But
Yeah.
anyway, well, Antonia,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I'm so glad you were game. I read her article and I just sent her an email like, I need to talk to you, and you were such a good sport. And thank you for taking this time and sharing this. I know everybody in my classroom is just gonna love hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, I've really enjoyed it and enjoyed the opportunity to meet you, Karen, and to meet someone who's a, like-minded spirit. As soon as I, started reading about what you were teaching, I thought, wow, we're really on the same page here and coming at it from slightly different angles, but, really wanting the same thing for horses. So if it's anything we can do to make a better world for horses, I'm all for it.
Sounds good to me. Thank you.
Okay.